Welcome to The Innovators by Scandinavian Man, a podcast about our changing world with the people who influence it. On this show, we cover some of the best and brightest minds within design, culture, fashion, technology, and sustainability. Mostly, but not always, from a Scandinavian perspective. I'm Konrad Olsson, and my guest today is Christopher Morency. Christopher is the editor-at-large for Highsnobiety, the world's leading online magazine for street culture and fashion. Christopher is a Canadian-born writer who grew up in the Netherlands. He cut his teeth at Vice and Fantastic Man before moving to London to start working for Business of Fashion. Since joining Highsnobiety, he has become one of the hardest working journalists in the fashion circuit, covering fashion weeks all over the world. Christopher, welcome to the show.
What's up? It's so strange to hear the whole list read out. I'm not used to that. Usually I'm the one interviewing people.
Exactly.
It's nice to hear.
Go a little bit closer to the microphone so people can hear you. Yeah. So we're here in Florence, Italy at the Pitti Uomo fair. And I wanted to talk to you for a few reasons. I think for one, I mean, you're a young guy. Obviously, I just read your resume. I think you have become one of the strongest voices in fashion journalism today. So
that's very kind words I have to
that's
say. Thank you.
My compliments. And with that, you are one of the rare beings on the international stage that actually cover Scandinavia in detail. So I'm going to be curious about hearing your perspective on the Scandinavian fashion scene.
Yeah, for sure.
But I wanted to begin at another more specific place. Last year, you wrote a piece that I think was super important and interesting. It was called "Streetwear Has a Sustainability Problem." And so I wanted to start there. So this was like a detailed account of where fashion stands in terms of sustainability and where specifically, streetwear stands. And you did this in one of the sort of strongest streetwear platforms there is. So I guess my first question is what's the background of this story, and how was the reception in the environment where you actually published it?
I mean, the reception was great, I have to say. First of all, many people I interviewed for that, everyone from brands to consultants to experts to retailers, they're very open to speak about it, even though some of them were at fault because we're at fault as an industry. And what was important to me with that piece is to also hold our own company accountable. So we spoke to our data person in Berlin, where our head offices are. And I think one of the data points we found is that by the end of the year, and this was last year, so throughout 2019, we would have written something like 2,500 pieces just on sneakers alone.
Just on sneakers.
And that's basically saying, buy this, because next week it won't be cool anymore.
Right. And
it was so important to talk about that, because we're part of the problem, but we have to be part of the solution as well. And it started off basically. It was very strange to me how streetwear never was speaking about this at all. I've never seen one piece about streetwear or sustainability. I've never seen anyone calling them out. I've never seen anyone coming up with solutions. And there was a big gap to do that in a really authoritative way on the platform that we have such a big reach on. And something I really wanted to do is not necessarily blame people, but also talk about why hasn't streetwear done anything. You have to understand the dynamics as to why no one's done anything to understand how we can go further. And that's kind of what I want to uncover. So
for someone who hasn't read the article, what were some of your findings? What was there stuff that you really were surprised about, or? I
mean, it was the culture. It was good to hear the reinforcement of why they hadn't done anything. So basically how it starts off, we speak about fashion as a larger ecosystem. There's really good stats in it. Something like every second a truck of landfill full of textiles goes to landfill.
Yeah, and that's something like, it's like 70-80% of...
I mean, that's just wild, isn't it?
Everything that's being produced is not even being sold. It's not even being,
Absolutely.
No one's touching it in terms of consumers.
There's billions and billions worth of unsold stock at warehouses, at storefronts. And then if you look at the recycling stage of it, which is the next stage, I think only 1% of clothing gets into something new, so it gets remade, just 1%. And then if we look at streetwear, basically what the piece really talks about is why they haven't done anything. For the longest time, they were so involved with creating culture. That was at the forefront of what a streetwear brand is, and about community and about collaboration. And I think in 2014, 2015, a bit before I joined Business of Fashion, we really started to see this intersection between luxury and streetwear. All of a sudden, the streetwear players were becoming more luxury, and all of a sudden, the luxury players were looking towards streetwear. They had been doing so for decades, obviously, with Yves Saint Laurent and Marc Jacobs, but to a big extent, it was something that luxury didn't really want to be part of. And I think when the two merged, all of a sudden, streetwear, as we know it, in the past couple of years, its connection to hip hop culture, it's blown up. And with that has the business component of it. I think for the longest time, a lot of businesses, streetwear businesses that is, didn't want to be involved with business. It was like a dirty word. They didn't want to be growing because growing was against what they stood for. And, we've seen that shift a bit in the last couple of years. We see people like Ronnie Fieg with Kith and Sam Ross from Cold Wall embracing business and bringing streetwear to the next level and also recreating the codes. But with that, obviously, comes a responsibility to be more sustainable. And that's what I basically say in the piece, to hold them accountable, to be saying, you guys are big enough now to also do something good. You're no longer that small brand that's in someone's garage, creating screen printed t-shirts. You're a serious business now, making multiple millions. You're contributing to this waste. And also you have a responsibility as the leading voice in fashion and menswear now to create change, because no one's going to listen to an H&M, but people will listen, to an Off-White or a Vuitton.
How do you define streetwear more broadly? I think that's interesting to sort of frame
this is something we talk about a lot at the office and also with my friends. It's funny to see a lot of traditional streetwear designers. They don't want to be associated with that word anymore. I think it's become quite diluted. It's become quite ambiguous. What does streetwear mean? It's not just hoodies. The way that I see streetwear is just the way the youth dresses. It's always existed, from punk culture to mod culture. If tomorrow the kids start wearing tailoring, then that's what streetwear is. I think streetwear as we know it in popular culture today is the hoodies, the sneakers, the technical outerwear, the graphic t-shirts. And to an extent that's true, but I think when Virgil's making a 5,000 pound leather hoodie, that's not necessarily streetwear anymore because that's not accessible for the kids.
Right. But I think the trajectory that you really are painting in this article is interesting, where you have something that is innately underground in a way, or from an history standpoint, but then it also becomes like from an identity standpoint. So these brands, these players, they see themselves as the underdogs, but all of a sudden they are a multi-billion-dollar, industry comparable to H&M and all these other places, which are so easy to sort of, I think you used the word chopping board somewhere in the article.
Yeah, it's crazy just to see how big some of these businesses have gotten. Like, Supreme a few years ago, as many of the listeners will know, sold for $500 million to the Carlyle Group, valuing the business at $1 billion. And then if we look at the statistics also, I think something like 250 million it's footwear, that's not just sneakers, footwear is produced every year.
Right.
And the average streetwear brand, creates up to 350 products a year, which is not a small business anymore. It's not something that's niche. It's not like a small countercultural thing anymore when we're doing those volumes.
So was there any backlash at all to the article?
No, not at all. The big thing, a lot of brands actually approached me to be like, what can we do better? And that's not my job to say. I like to connect them to people that actually know a lot better than I do. People like Dio at the Bear Scouts, and the guys from Public School who created this new blanks program, basically from upcycled and recycled cotton to create blank T-shirts that they then give to streetwear brands or sell to streetwear brands for a low cost.
Right.
So it's no longer a bad barrier to entry to create it with sustainable materials. There's no excuse to not do it anymore. So this is what I like to really support. And it's about these guys. These guys are making a difference, and it's also small wins. I think Dio calls it from the Bear Scouts. He's about implement small wins as a business, because you can't transform overnight. It's impossible to do. You have your business in place, logistics. You don't be afraid to embrace sustainability with small things, and it will lead up to something bigger.
So, a large part of streetwear has been these. A large part of it is based on sneakers, but it's also based on like T-shirts and hoodies. These sort of basics.
Yeah.
Where you put prints on them or messages or other types of sort of identity bearing messages. So you're saying that really it's the raw material that should be transformed first?
Yeah, it's two things. So my personal problem with streetwear, as we can bracket it as right now, is first of all, it's a cheap product, like you mentioned. When you're working a lot on virgin cotton, very often we're talking about the hoodies, we're talking about the t-shirts. When you look at sneakers, it's one of the most complex, along with tailoring, one of the most complex items to create because of all the different compartments and stages it has to go through. So it's very, very hard to recycle that and to upcycle that in the end. After when the wearer has finally worn it. And the problem, secondly, is the speed at which streetwear has pushed its product out. So basically, we're saying, it's basically the whole business model, around drops, weekly drops, bi-weekly drops. We're basically saying as an industry, if you don't buy this week's drop, then you're last week's news. It's not, that's a toxic way to think. And it's, to be honest, I said in the piece as well, it's streetwear as we know it today is fast fashion for men. We'll have a lot of, predominantly females going to, the H&Ms and to the Zaras and to the fast fashion giants there. Whereas for the men, that's what a Supreme is, that's what a Palace is, that's what a Stussy is.
Right.
They buy on a weekly basis, they buy on a monthly basis, and then whenever the next drop comes out, they need to have the next thing, and what happens to that old thing? I mean, in streetwear's defense, the good thing about streetwear is the resale culture when it comes to sustainability, because it's a good way to end source product that you can get your hands on, but also you don't necessarily throw it away after you want to buy the next thing. There's a life after that you can sell to someone else that's been really looking for that piece, which is good. But still, there's too much out there.
I think it's interesting that I would believe that had you written this article 5 years ago, there would have been another type of reaction. I think we are at a stage in fashion industry as a whole that we have. I think everyone at least have come to clear that we have to talk about this and have to do something. Then the next step is what to do. I think that's much more unclear to many actors out there.
Yeah, exactly. When I speak to brands, very often they tell me we're afraid to talk about sustainability. We're actually really implementing a lot of things behind the scenes. We don't want to open the floodgates to negative criticism because once we say, look at this is sustainable, this part of our business, the comments we get both internally and externally is like, yeah, well, we can't say that because what about this, this, and this? So that's where brands struggle with a lot. But I say, communicate it with the audience. Be very transparent about we don't have all the answers. We do still need to be better with a lot of compartments, but we are doing our very best by implementing these small wins, by doing these smaller capsule collections that test the audience response, by making a difference, by finding things how we can upcycle materials and create less waste, by doing less in terms of how often we create product. And a really good example of that is what Samuel Ross did with a cold wall. And I wouldn't necessarily call that streetwear anymore because he's evolving his line a lot. But I think when he started off 3-4 years ago, I think 5 years ago even, it was streetwear as we knew it. It was luxury streetwear. And what he's doing now as he's transforming his line is also creating less. It's a big part of his ethos is I need to create less but better. And I've been speaking to some friends. I think that's really what's going to happen in the 2020s is it will be less but better.
I think one of the largest and I think most difficult things, and I think you touch upon this a little bit in the article, is that is the fact that even as you say, okay, so 1% gets recycled. So if we do twice that, it's 2%, or twice that, it's 4%. It's still pretty small part of it, and then we can source better materials, but it's still you have 70% that's not even being used. So we're overproducing at a rate that is staggering and shocking, and we should talk about that. But then you have this aspect of it which sort of runs to the core of our general capitalist system is, and this is where it gets tricky because brands need to grow to sustain themselves. I mean, there's a sustainability aspect in terms of being a sustainable business as well. So then you have the issue of, I mean, of course, if we all would sort of keep our money, don't buy things, and run the business, to the woods in a way, okay, you wouldn't have this problem. But of course, this is not going to stop anytime soon. So it's more about steering this huge, enormous sort of ship into a new direction and make sure that we if we could just overproduce 50% less, that would be an amazing achievement in terms of sustainability. So I think
Exactly.
here where it becomes really, really tricky, and that's where I think brands feel in a way guilty, because there's we have to be a commercial brand. We can't have this on the top of our agenda.
I mean, they have stakeholders, a lot of brands. The luxury though about streetwear brands is that it's still often very much owned by the original founders. We see that a bit less and less now. More people are open to investment, whereas that was not the case for a lot of streetwear brands in the past. But like I said, a lot of owners still own it, so they do have the choice to create something different without necessarily having to chase business growth. But it's a good point you make. No business is going to accept less money.
Right.
It's a fact. But I was just looking at my phone because this was a really important stat. It says over 1/3 of consumers have already switched from their preferred brand to another because it credibly stands for positive environmental practices. And that's from the Boston Consulting Group. And this is exactly what we tap into in the article as well. Is in 5 to 10 years, and probably even before that, it won't be cool or financially responsible for brands to not be sustainable.
Right.
And that's where we'll see the shift, where once the consumer mindset changes in mass, because I think sustainability is still a privileged thing to talk about. A lot of people that come from poor areas in the world, they don't have the privilege of talking about sustainability or spending more money on something. They need to get clothes, so they'll go for the cheapest option. But once that transcends the sustainability conversation to the masses, and we create ways to make it more cost efficient to buy into sustainable products, that's when we'll see a real shift on the consumer side in mass. And then all of a sudden, it won't be financially viable for brands not to adopt this model. So it's just a number of years before this happens. So if they don't change now, I get your point on, they have a financial obligation to their investors and to other stakeholders. But real investors know that if they don't invest in sustainability now, they won't see any return of investment anyway in a few years.
Well, and this goes into we met last night and had a conversation about some of these topics, and it's also about, as a brand, you cannot only make a product and put it out there. You can that single act of just doing that won't sustain itself. You have to add something else to it. And I think streetwear has that innate. It has that sort of cultural reference and cultural sort of credibility. But I think as a brand, if you just do a product, if you just do a shirt or a sweater, and you have nothing else to add to it and no story to tell around it, you're not going to be sustain yourself either, because the consumer will demand something more.
Exactly. Like, consumers see brands as their friends. That's the way I see it. You expect them to be loyal. You expect them not to do anything you wouldn't do. You expect them to align on your values, to be consistent. And if a brand doesn't have more than just product, then it won't exist for very long, like you said. We've seen this for years. You have Chanel spas, and you have Bulgari hotels and Armani bars, and experiences like that. I think what we're going to see in the next 5 years is we're going to go even deeper than that. What will brands be able to sell to the consumer and offer them, which isn't necessarily tangible? So I'm talking about knowledge, I'm talking about experience, I'm talking about community. How can you trade in that? And that's where streetwear always has excelled at. They've always created this whole ecosystem around their brands before even selling products sometimes. These friendship groups already existed. They already stood for skate culture, for other sports. This underground culture that always existed around brands, and sometimes brands get birthed from it.
Right.
And this is exactly what luxury brands are trying to chase. But it's very hard to create culture and meaningful values if you start with product first. So that's the challenge for a lot of brands, I think. Now, they look towards streetwear they think if we can adopt this streetwear aesthetic, we can get the consumer to come in because they think we have the same values. And that's what so many brands get wrong today. People are not going to go into a Vuitton or Dior shop just based off of good product. They want something more than that.
And you don't think if hiring Virgil Abloh is enough?
Virgil's a great designer. I think what he does is great. he has fans and he has people that don't like what he does, and I like what he does because what he stands for. But I do question what original kid that he's trying to speak to can afford a $4,000 hoodie. You know,
Right.
that's for a very specific customer. That's not for the kid on the street. And we did this piece on Highsnobiety recently saying, what trends do the editors want to see die in 2020? And one of the things that one of our guys on the commerce team said was fake culture, I think it was. Basically saying you can't say you're actually for the kids if you're not creating accessible product for the kids.
Right.
So that's a bit where, you know, the contrast comes in.
Let's stick on this subject, but I got to go back to the article one last time. I got to say, I'm a little bit surprised that you didn't get more, I don't know, at least negative feedback or angry feedback, or I mean, it feels like you pulled the pants down on this whole industry in a way. You know, if I feel like it's one, people don't care about the issue, sustainability, or two, they care, but they realize they can't do anything. Or
I think from the industry, it was really positive. Just to go back to what I said earlier, I did see some comments on some of our Instagram posts around the article from our audience that had thoughts about it. You know, they were really talking about, oh no, it's not that bad. That was almost their sense. They were almost defensive about the streetwear industry not being that bad. So for me, that showed how important this piece is, and a follow-up as well to even educate a lot of these people.
Defense came from the consumers rather.
There was a bit of defense from the consumers, yeah.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah, and that shows me that we need to have more people talking about this in the streetwear industry to educate the consumers.
Right.
And you know, also on their stance to be, you don't need a Supreme t-shirt every single week. Yeah.
And from I'm also curious from an internal standpoint. I mean, obviously you published the article and your editors made the decision to do this. But when you come up with stats like that, 2,500 articles about sneakers, is that something that spurs a discussion around, should we actually, should we cut that down, or how do we? It is cover this?
It is. We want to do a big push with sustainability, but in an honest way, because again, like I mentioned, we also contribute to selling product. We sell product ourselves with our commerce site right now. We have own Highsnobiety product, so we also are forced to think of new ways to be better on a daily basis. And research like this, we see it almost as research, articles like this. It shows us how we can be better on both the content side and the commerce side. Now, is it more important to talk about these things? It is. What do we do with sneaker drops? Do we have to report on every single sneaker drop? What makes a good sneaker drop? What makes a bad sneaker drop? When are we doing a brand a favor, and when don't we really have to post it, to be honest? So it's definitely a discussion we have around it. But at the end of the day, like any business, we are in the business of promoting things, and always through our own Highsnobiety lens, and it's always through our taste levels. But we are in a fashion industry that is contributing to waste, and you just have to find ways to be better every day.
I have a question I always ask people nowadays when I do interviews, and I think it's always interesting to hear different kinds of answers, and I also ask it because it's a sort of a theme we rarely talk about, and the question is, why is fashion important?
That's such a good question. I see fashion, I've always compared it to the food industry. It's something you literally can't live without. Like you can't live without clothes, right? For me personally, I find fashion important because it says something obviously about me, but it also says something that I stand for. I always compare it to the 4 tabs in the neck with the Margiela tabs. There's 4 stitches. Right. If you know, you know. And nowadays, it's so much deeper than fashion. Fashion is pop culture. The food industry, the fashion industry, the music industry, the art industry, they're all one as pop culture. It's the same thing nowadays. So when I wear a certain garment, it says something not just about what my fashion taste is, it says something about where I like to hang out. It says something about what music I like very often. It says something about what do I like art-wise. You can't always judge someone on just their clothes, but it will give you quite a good idea. If you see, I'm wearing a Jill Sanders shirt today.
Right.
It said I want the world to see something about me when I wear this. We're wearing a suit jacket today, but in a casual way, you want to project something like that. And I think it will always be important. But But I don't necessarily think the way that the fashion industry is heading now, and the speed at which the fashion industry is going, it's not necessarily about creativity anymore. It's about branding. That's when these questions that you ask become interesting. Like, is fashion important?
Well, I think it's funny. If I do this long enough for you, maybe I can collect all the answers because they're really dispersed. I mean, I have people that are really working with fashion, have done it their whole life, that says fashion is not important. And
I think I don't agree with. I mean, everyone has their different opinions, but I think it's a bit dismissive and a bit short-sighted to say fashion is not important.
I think it's also important. I did a sustainability symposium in Stockholm last year, and you know, my first question was, what the hell is wrong with the fashion industry? And that spurred a discussion in one direction. And then I had one panelist, a Swedish journalist that covers sustainability a lot, that says, well, I have to say in the beginning, I think fashion is really important for a lot of people, and it's really meaningful for people in general, how they perceive themselves and how they project themselves to the world. And we have to say that first, and then we can talk about the problems. And I was like, a little bit taken aback by that, because we rarely, make a point out of it. It's like it's. I think it's dangerous also to come to a position where we only talk about the problems, and I think we can sense also at a trade show like Pitti Uomo that the industry is in flux in other ways, and people they know they're lagging on the sustainability work that they need to do within their brands, and it's always becomes the sort of self-esteem runs out of the brands in a way that I think is negative for progress.
For sure, absolutely, but I do feel with a lot of brands, they don't want to necessarily implement the changes.
Right.
I think with a lot of brands are doing it because it's such a buzzword now, sustainability and responsive design. I don't necessarily think that every brand has the right intentions. It's too many brands still prioritize growth, which is very understandable in a lot of their cases, but they don't understand the importance of this subject. And they don't educate themselves by speaking to people that are actually leading these changes. Because once you speak to these people, you'll actually be like, holy shit, I had no idea we're that bad at what we're doing.
Right.
I didn't know until a few years ago.
Yeah.
I started speaking to people. I had no idea that a truckload is being thrown away every second, like I said before this. I didn't know that only 1% was recycled into new garments. And once you find out about it, it changes on a personal level. You start looking differently at consumption. I bought a lot more secondhand and vintage, or try to not buy it all. I am in the business where you get a lot of things gifted, and then you do take flights around the world, and I'm not contributing to the sustainability conversation as I should, which is problematic as well. But you have to find ways to educate yourself to be better at that, which I think we all have to do. But
there's also things, the more you learn, and I think as a fellow journalist, I think you can see this as well. The more you learn about how the industry works, I've spoke to one person within the industry recently that works a lot on these questions. Said like, there's been an enormous development in the sourcing department, in the materials you can actually access today. So the materials are out there. The factories that produce in better ways are out there. So it's really up to the brands now to go and get it. You can't. There's no excuses now. You can't say like, I would like to use organic cotton. I just can't find it.
No, I mean that's such a bad excuse if they use that. And like I was saying before, a lot of companies like the guys from public school. Are working on ways, and Dio as well from the Bear Scouts, they are working on ways to make it even more financially viable for brands than the non-organic option. That will take a bit of time, but once that's there, there's no excuse anymore. And then we have to talk about the speed element, obviously. And there's also a lot of elements, what a lot of people don't know. I was speaking to Matthew Williams over Copenhagen Fashion Summit a number of months ago, and he introduced me to his manufacturer for hardware, which is made in a most sustainable as possible way. So there's no chemicals in it. It's made from recycled metal, etc. So this is like for the zippers, for the buttons. I had no idea that existed. I think a lot of brands don't know that existed. And it's such a small tweak that you can make that you can be better in the world.
Right. Did you always want to be a fashion journalist?
No, I didn't. No, I always wanted to be a film director.
Really?
Yeah, I always wanted to do that. I studied media in the Netherlands. And I actually made a documentary with a few friends about a guy with a handicap who wanted to go to a sex service essentially, and we put out an ad out there if there was anyone out there that wanted to do that experience, and he signed up, and we met over a few weeks with him to make sure that the intentions were right, and it was, and we made a short documentary about that, which I then sent to Vice later for an internship, and it was very Vice, so they hired me there, and I started writing about it, and my girlfriend at the time was in fashion, same girlfriend right now, she's still in fashion, but at the time she was in fashion in the Netherlands. So she used to always bring me to parties, and then I was sitting next to a girl who worked at ID Magazine, which is part of Vice, and she used to bring me to parties, and you get into the scene there, and I really liked it. You know, I liked that it was so much bigger than just clothes. I thought, you know, the fashion industry is something I would never work in, and then you go and it's about music, and it's about community, and it's about culture, and it's about food, and it's about art, and everything comes together. You look at pop culture today, like it's about what Rihanna dresses on the red carpet. It's about who that designer is that A$AP Rocky's wearing. You know, it's so much bigger than just clothes nowadays, and that's what attracted me really to it. But always from the business perspective, though. Always about what's behind this. Fashion journalism, like fashion design, is so oversaturated. I look at the London scene alone, and I look at the amount of magazines we have, and the amount of editors we have, and the amount of bloggers and influencers we have, and the amount of brands and PRs, and it's so saturated. It's so unnecessary to have this many people in this industry. And that's what really attracted me to the business of fashion, was they looked at it from a very different angle. It was always objective from a bird's eye point of view, and it was really saying, it was posing questions, you know. It was never looking at fashion from the present day. It wasn't about observing fashion, or this is what it is, or this is what happened last night. It was always about, this is what's happened. What does that mean for the future? And let's offer solutions and hypotheses by speaking to these experts outside of fashion, inside of fashion, to offer solutions for the industry to be better or to challenge them. And that's what I really loved about it.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I think you talk about the identity part of it as well. I mean, you're too young to remember a time when the record collection was the sort of cover of your identity. You know, what types of record that you had in your home, that was your identity. And I think in the 90s that sort of peaked in a way. And then you know, as the digitization of everything, it took that away. So I'm curious, maybe you would have been a music journalist had you come up in
maybe. I mean, I'm 25 now. So I was definitely before my time. That was.
I learned that last night. It was staggering to me. I thought you were older.
1994. That was the year. What we say at Highsnob is, you know, brands are the new bands.
Right.
And if you really want to be successful as a fashion brand today, as any brand really, you try to convert them into fans. And then all of a sudden it doesn't become about consumption anymore, about consuming this thing. Because of the loyalty that these consumers have, it becomes about collecting. So there's only a few brands that I collect. So I'll go to a Thom Browne, you know, and these are pieces, I'll have maybe 6-7 pieces in my closet now. I collect that and I take care of it. And when it's broken, I bring it to the shop to get repaired. And when it's dirty, I bring it to the dry cleaners to get cleaned. I don't have that connection with other fashion brands. And it poses this question in my head, why do I have that? Why does my girlfriend have this with Old Celine? Why do all my friends have this with Margiela, you know? Why do people have this with Vintage Calm? What is it about these brands that transcends the notion of just a garment? And this also comes back to what we were talking about earlier about the sustainability aspect, about it being important for the future and to be part of the values that you buy into. And that's what I'm so fascinated by. You know, this is exactly what every single fashion brand in the world is trying to figure out now. How can we be culturally credible to the consumer without being forced? How can we talk about sustainability in a real way without sounding greenwashy? How can we talk about community without sounding fake and without sounding forced? And you know, the answer to that is don't be for everyone. It's very simple. I look at a designer like Emily Bodie from New York who makes all these amazing upcycled
like the patchwork
design. The patchwork jackets and the patchwork shirts, and they're very expensive, but it's something you save up for. And she'll find vintage bed linens in Oklahoma that she'll then turn into a beautiful jacket, or she'll find vintage handkerchiefs dead stock somewhere in this factory in Texas that she'll make in a beautiful shirt. The storytelling behind that, the sustainability aspect behind it, she will only make a few of them because, you know, the fabric runs out. So every piece is unique. That's what I love. And she's very clear in her vision about, I'm not for everyone. The design might not appeal to everyone. The price point is not for everyone because it's pretty expensive. The storytelling might not be for everyone. You can't get it everywhere. There's only a few retailers that stock it, and she has her own store in New York. That's what brands should really be looking at. You know, who am I really for? And I can't be for everyone. There's some luxury brands, you know, to riff off of that, there's some luxury brands that I don't think are doing great. I mean, I won't name names today, but I don't think are doing great because they'll do a capsule collection with a celebrity, but then they'll do a beautiful collection in Paris or Milan. And then from the women's side, they'll do a beautiful collection with couture techniques. Whereas they also do a collection for men with a streetwear designer. And it's like, for who are you trying to sell to?
Right.
I get that you're trying to appeal to everyone, but who are you actually trying to sell to? And we have a big report coming up, without rambling on too much, we have a big report coming up about this subject. And it basically, we talk about, as a brand, how can you appeal to different segments in a culturally credible way? And a big takeaway from that is try to find these communities that are already out there, that are already interacting with your brands. And Patagonia is such a good example with this. You look at these, you know, these streetwear kids, and they buy into Patagonia because it's environmentally conscious. It has this 90s vibe towards it. It's something their dad would wear, which is this anti-fashion thing that all, you know, the Gen Zers love now. But then you look at the fashion bros in New York that work on Wall Street, who all wear these corporate vests that Patagonia used to sponsor for them. They don't do that now anymore for all the companies that are not sustainable as a company. But they used to sponsor these vests, Patagonia.
What was this Instagram account? It's called
there's an Instagram account.
West.
Right? I can't remember what it's called exactly, but
it's not something Midtown.
About all these, these Patagonia bros, these finance bros that basically buy it. But then you also have the hardcore climber and the hiker that was originally intended for, that still buys it just because it's the best quality. So this is not something Patagonia has necessarily set out to appeal to all these groups, but these groups with their own rituals and symbiotics and cultural codes have adapted these brands from a very different way. So as a brand, what you would want to do, and maybe Patagonia is not the right example, but what you would want to then do is see, how do these brands interact, or how these consumers interact with my brand? What do they find important? How can I work with them? Never sell to them, but sell, you know, with them. And then it becomes this really real conversation you're having with the consumer, as opposed to just actively trying to find out or create these new consumer groups, which is what a lot of luxury brands are doing today.
Yeah, well, that goes right back into what we talked about with streetwear, where you sort of ignite a subculture or a you know, something that's already out there. So with Patagonia, it could be, you know, the hikers or outdoorsmen or whatever. Like, they are already there. You're just servicing a target group that already exists.
Exactly.
Whereas, you know, I think to me personally, when fashion becomes sort of distasteful for myself, is when you try to create that as a brand. You try to just invent something and then with marketing try to impose on the consumer that you really need to have this to be, you know, happy.
I see that with a lot of that's a really good point. I see that with a lot of Italian brands, actually. A lot of Italian luxury brands that, you know, they'll create a sneaker because they feel that that's what will get them the younger audience. So they try to figure out, how can we sell a sneaker to this younger audience, but no, you know, kid is going to buy an £800 sneaker from a classic tailoring brand. It's just not what they would look at necessarily. The reason it works for Balenciaga, for instance, why it works for Gucci, is because they've created, you know, this culture around their brands where they create memes and they create smaller merchandise things, like a stuffed puppet, for instance, that feels so true to the brand. They don't take themselves too seriously. They're not too stiff, like some Italian brands still are. So it makes sense for that. And to go back on what we were speaking about, Virgil Abloh, if he's a good fit for Vuitton, if, you know, he can speak to the crowd. I think a lot of people are quick to dismiss him, but people don't think about who he's actually appealing to, because he is appealing to that consumer that might have grown up with streetwear and is now in a later stage in life, that does have disposable income to pay money for this, but that doesn't necessarily want to buy traditional suits. He is appealing to different demographics that do have a lot of money, even though they might have not been interacting with streetwear in the past, but they still want to buy into that aesthetic, and they don't want to buy Supreme because it's not for them. You know, it was a gap in the market that he filled, which was luxury streetwear, essentially. And what better place to do that than the biggest luxury house in the world?
Do you think fashion brands, leverage the available technologies enough today?
In what way? What kind of technologies?
In terms of how you can use technology to streamline your production, or I mean, we can talk about technology from a communication standpoint and Instagram and all that, but I think from a way of if you make your production more efficiently and don't overproduce and so forth, I think there are from what I've seen, a lot of things you can use from AI and how to sort of find out, or what's the word, leverage the demand with what you should produce, stuff like that. Is that something you look into at Highsnob?
To be honest, I know some people that are into that. It's definitely worth doing a piece on.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right with that. The biggest takeaway again for brands is to speak to people like that.
Right.
But very often brands don't know where to even find these people. How am I supposed to find a company that is doing great work for the world and they can talk about optimize your inventory and optimize the sustainability aspect of like the zippers and the buttons. But a lot of brands have no idea where to find these people.
Because there's such a huge part of fashion, and that goes into this sort of the overproduction. It's just you put a finger up in the air and feel like, well, probably let's do 500 jackets this season. Probably, we don't know. And then you you can go to a trade show and sort of feel the market, but it's so much about
you don't know,
sensing the.
You don't know, and then obviously when something sells really well that you didn't expect and didn't anticipate, you do a massive order for the second time because you're like, shit, we have to get it right now because it's selling really well. And by the time the deliveries come to these e-commerce websites, the consumers moved on. And then you end up with sale and stock and you have to like discount it heavily. So the market's definitely broken in that aspect. But again, it comes back to the consumer just having to buy less product, right?
I think actually sort of counterintuitively in a way, I think we'll see probably more innovations from the likes of Amazon and H&M and Zara in that department in terms of, I mean, they really have the muscle to invest in these technologies that can foresee demand in a much different way. But I think also that you have to add some kind of almost legislation in terms of, you can't overproduce in this matter, or you can't use these types of materials or virgin materials and so forth. That's a whole other bracket,
this is a big key takeaway from the fashion summit as well, was that people tend to think of the sustainability conundrum as a fashion problem, or within the fashion industry as just a fashion problem. But with fashion, it's about these stakeholders. So the financial institutions that back a lot of these fashion brands and these investors need to be open to see less return on investment straight away for a longer term growth. So a company might adopt bigger changes in their production system, but then the investors need to be open-minded to also see longer-term return on investments. Not these short-term wins, these quarterly wins where it's like, why did you dip in sale? It's what we always talk about. It's like, oh, Gucci dipped in sale. They're less big than last season. It's like, who cares? They might have done something really
already
great.
Already grown like 500%.
Exactly. They might have like invested heavily in a sustainability thing. I don't know. And if that's the case, then investors should be chill with that. And then also, it needs to happen on the consumer side. It needs to happen on the business side, on the financial side, but also on the legislation side. Like you said, there need to be laws in place where you're not allowed to overproduce. I think that's definitely the future. And it's sad that it's come to that we can't hold ourselves accountable, but we clearly can't, So different compartments need to come into this fashion industry to change it. But one thing about streetwear, to get back on that, which I wanted to mention earlier, was the biggest opportunity that streetwear has is to change the industry. Just to end that story on a positive note.
You think so?
Yeah, because it's been about camaraderie all that time. It's been about collaboration. When I speak to all my friends that have streetwear brands or even fashion brands, they all talk about sharing knowledge, right? So the Copenhagen scene, and it's a good point to venture into the Scandinavian fashion. Right. The Copenhagen scene is so great at that. You have these guys like Jacob and Silas from Soulland that work really closely together with other fashion brands, and they educate each other. They're all friends. They talk about, this is the factory that actually has really good and this is a great factory that can help you with your merchandising strategy to produce less. They're so collaborative in that respect. And they speak to people outside of their own realm. So they have friends in Paris, they have friends in New York, they have friends in Milan. Everyone's educating each other in the streetwear industry. It's a really opportunity they can have. that's the big problem with the luxury fashion industry, is that they're using too much of their sustainability advancements and the technologies they're creating and all these things as a competitive advantage for financial growth.
Right. They're not
No one's
sharing.
Zara is not talking to H&M. Vuitton is not talking to Saint Laurent. They're not talking about how can we actually open source this and create something for the whole industry to be better. Oh no, we're going to use this great technology we just found to sell more product in a better way, essentially, or to like greenwash it. And that's where streetwear comes in. It can really make a real change. Allbirds is a good example in this as well. They're not necessarily streetwear, but the footwear brand. What they basically have done, they've created this new foam for their soles. I don't know if you know about this.
No.
For the new soles.
No.
And
It's the direct-to-consumer type.
yes,
yeah.
yes. They're massive. They sell like 100 million pairs of shoes or worth of merchandise like in a year, and they've only existed for like 3 years,
Wow.
right? But
Less,
they're
less traction in Scandinavia, I think.
yeah. So Allbirds, well, it's big. It's definitely big in the U.S.
Yeah.
and the tech scene, in the Silicon Valley. So all the big Silicon Valley guys wear it, and women. And what they basically have done is they found this technology to create these soles from, I think it was something like wood pulp or something like sugar cane or something like that. And what they've done with that technology is they've open sourced it. So they've basically said, anyone that wants to use this, here is where to find these manufacturers. We can even help you. This is actually how you create it, etc. We want you guys to use this. So that's such a good example of not using it for a competitive advantage. They're saying anyone can use this. Adidas can use this. Nike can use it. Our competitors. We just want the world to be better. And that's the future of how we can all become better. That's what streetwear is doing now.
That's the Elon Musk strategy right there.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah. So segueing into Scandinavia, I think you've been to Stockholm Fashion Week when it was still existing. And been
The
to
last one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last one. Yeah. What's your take on Scandinavia? Why is it important to go to Scandinavia for you as a journalist?
I mean, it's important. We always talk about Paris and New York and Milan and Pitti and London, and that's really the big 4 or 5 that we care about. Then you have, I would say, like a second tier around that with Seoul and with Tokyo and with Shanghai now, which is a really important one. And obviously with Stockholm and Copenhagen, we're a big part of that as well. It's so important to look at these things because fashion is not necessarily just happening with these big brands. They might sell the most, they might be the most popular even in these smaller countries, but that's not where everything happens. It's so important to look at the homegrown scenes and to find out who's actually buzzing here. What are they doing that's different that we can take away and implement at home? Who are people we should know about? I've met some of my closest friends in these countries just because they've been doing such a cool things on the sustainability front, on the retail front. They make amazing designs. It's something you just can't find if you just are always stuck in these big bubbles. And I like the culture, to be honest. It's such a laid-back culture. When I go to Stockholm and to Copenhagen, it's so chill. Everyone's really nice. Doesn't seem like too many people have the stress that we have in London or in New York. And me coming from the Netherlands is very similar to our culture.
Right.
It's not very flashy. You're not trying to be something you're not. It's very democratic. There's no huge hierarchy. There's no huge class system necessarily that you're confronted with when you step out of the plane. And it all aligns more with my values and I think the fashion as well. And I think what's important in Stockholm and in Copenhagen is also on the price point level, it's very different, right? It's a lot more contemporary.
We don't have the luxury.
No, not necessarily. And you can go to Paris if you want to find amazing couture or amazing luxury streetwear or amazing luxury in general, but you can't really find anything in between. So you go to Copenhagen, I'm going again in 2 weeks, the end of January, and it's so exciting to see because this is clothing that people that attend the shows, because it's very democratic in that aspect as well. You have a lot of fans and also a lot of influencers attending these shows can actually purchase. It's not something, that's always the thing we always start with fashion editors. We always go to the shows, but no one can really afford the clothes.
Right.
Right? So that's not the case in Copenhagen and Stockholm. You actually go to the shows and you see things, I want to buy that, I want to buy this.
It'll fit your reporter salary.
Yeah, a bit better.
So what are some of the favorite brands and actors in Scandinavia that you come to learn?
I mean, the first luxury brand I really loved was Acne, obviously.
Right.
It was something, I remember going on holiday with my girlfriend Bonnie to Stockholm when we just started dating, and we wanted to go to one Acne store and we ended up going to every single one of them. I think there were like 6 or 7 or something.
Right.
We just went to every single store, you know, checking out the merchandise, and we only ended up like buying a T-shirt each because we were students. We obviously didn't have that much money to spend on fashion. And then I think what the guys from 80s are doing is sick. It's just so different, you know. It's, you know, when you look at the footwear design, they don't think in boundaries. It's why can't we have a thigh-high boot for a man? You know, why can't we have a chunky rave sneaker for a girl? Why can't we have a great oversized denim pants for both genders, for all genders? And it's something that you're missing a lot in fashion. And they're so consistent as well with their merchandising and with their visuals and the castings that they do. This again is a brand that is so aligned across the board. They're so culturally credible because you meet these guys, Jonathan and Max, the founders, you meet them, and they're literally like the brand. They're dressed head to toe in the brand. All their friends are. They're all friends with musicians, with cooks. They're all friends of them. They walk in the show. You know, it's very real. Like we see in New York as well with like Telfar and Baragon. And we used to see with Hood by Air. It's very real and authentic. And then, I mean, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan, and people know this at the Highsnobiety office, but every single person in the Highsnobiety office is obsessed with our legacy, especially in New York and Berlin. Every time I tell them, like, I really like the clothing, but I think because I grew up in Europe, in West Europe, it's just, we're used to seeing that kind of clothing. Whereas I think in the US, it's so different, you know? They don't really have that type of dressing necessarily. But everyone's a big, huge fan of our legacy in the office. And then on the Copenhagen front, I'm always a big fan of Soulland. I think they're great. Sunflower is a good up-and-coming one, which I think is good. And then for the women's side, it's Saxpolz and Cecilia Bonsa, which are just killing it.
From your perspective, what is the perception of Scandinavia right now?
I mean, we talked about this before. My problem with the perception of people in Scandinavia in the media, we're saying it's trickled down to the consumers. It's all about the Scandi girl, right? It's very much about, oh, the cute Scandi girl, she rides her bike, she might have like some food in her basket, she picks up her kid, you know, she's really cool, she wears or really colorful dresses or really minimalist. That story's been told so often. And if you actually go to Scandinavia, you actually see that there's so many different stories to tell. On the equal level, it's not like, oh, this is the biggest scene, the Scandi girl, and there's actually a smaller niche. No, it's like there's literally so much happening on the menswear side that no one ever talks about. And it's actually the menswear that's driving the sustainability in Scandinavia. It's not necessarily the women's that much. So there's so many better stories to be told with menswear now. So that's what I guess I try to do, and also we try to do at Highsnobiety, is to go to these smaller markets and to find the stories that no one's telling.
Well, you do a great job, and I've always been very proud to have you come to Scandinavia and report on it, and really at depth taking it seriously. Because I think also in a way, I think as Scandinavians we are also guilty of creating these sort of caricatures of ourselves. Because I think a lot of when people think of Scandinavia, and especially Scandinavians themselves, you know, I think globally it almost becomes this sort of utopia in a way. It's like, you know, we have this great healthcare program, and you know,
it's perfect,
everyone
idyllic state.
Yeah, exactly, and all these things. And I think this is something I want to use this podcast for, actually, to talk more about, because I want to sort of dissect that in a bit, because I think it's a good way. And I think certainly with Scandinavian Man, just naming the brand, that we're certainly guilty of projecting a sort of idealized you know, image of the Scandinavian man. But I think we need to sort of nuance that in a bit as well. So I'm curious about, do you find that as well? If you could, when you just say Scandinavia, what kind of images come to mind with people?
I mean, people definitely think about, like you mentioned, you know, it's quite an idyllic state. You can't, especially Norway for some reason. I've never been to Norway myself, but
maybe that's why.
Norway's always this, you know, this utopia. It's beautiful. The air is clean. There's amazing healthcare.
Right.
There's an amazing social system going on there. It's like the Netherlands on steroids, you know. It's like even more perfect. There's a good work-life balance. People get off at 2:00 in the afternoon. You know, obviously that's not the truth, but and. So I wrote a piece for the Business of Fashion. I just thought about it. I think it was like 2016, and it compared the Danish fashion scene to the Swedish fashion scene. It was basically saying, this is again when the Scandi girl was just coming up. It was talking about what's the difference between the two, and what's the reason why Swedish brands have been so much more successful than Danish brands. I think it's changed now a bit, but that was the consensus back then.
Right.
You know, you look at Swedish history of business. Sony Ericsson's Swedish, right?
Yeah, well, Ericsson is.
Ericsson,
Sony
yeah.
obviously isn't, but the
Sony,
Ericsson.
you have like brands like Sony Ericsson and like IKEA and H&M and
Right.
Spotify. And what Swedish brands are really good at doing is from day one, taking their brand global. It's always about how can we create a brand for the world, not necessarily for a small country, which I think is what a lot of Danish brands tend to do. They try to stay in their own ecosystem, and then what happens, it's very difficult to then go to an international stage. And I think what the Scandi girl, you know, that persona has done, though, is it's brought more attention to the Danish girls and the Swedish girls, where people are looking at these more localized scenes, and actually looking what's actually happening here. Oh, this brand that might have not gotten attention internationally is actually quite cool to look at. But then again, you end up with like a piece of like the same brands every season.
There's a difference between Sweden and Denmark that I actually learned after.
What's the biggest difference?
Well, it was interesting because when I started Scandinavian Man, obviously I've been to Denmark quite a lot of times, but I hadn't really worked with Danish people. And I ended up at a dinner with a famous famous Danish artist. His name escapes me now. He was part of a trio that did a huge exhibition at the Turbine Hall at Tate Modern. So we can Google based on that. But he said that, well, you Swedes, you're so good at washing away your Swedishness.
Really?
So he said, like, and we talked about it. So I think he's
good.
actually right. Like when we look at Alexander Skarsgård, and we're super happy, we're so proud of this, you know, this Viking that's taken over Hollywood and so forth. And it's like his English is so perfect. You can't even hear his Swedish. And for a Swedish person, that's like, you know, success. We made it on an international stage. And I think that goes a little bit into some of the brands that you mentioned, like Acne and 80s and so forth. They don't necessarily want to push their Swedishness. They want to be an actor on the international stage. Whereas a Danish, and obviously hugely generalizing here, but I think in the Danish culture, it's much more important to keep your Danishness. So look, it's like the equivalent would be Mads Mikkelsen as an actor. He still has some left of his sort of Danish accent in him, and I've looked at our respective cultures very much through this lens since, because I think there is something to it, and I think there is something to the fact that we Swedes get more successful on an international stage, obviously generalizing again, but I think it also, you know, to me it's not surprising that this whole image of a Scandi girl, the hygge and all that, that's Danish, because that's a local Danish culture that we don't have that in Sweden. In Swedes, we are workers, and we do good, and we want to move to New York and speak perfect English in a way.
That's such a good point. I compare, it's a similar comparison between the Germans and the Dutch. A lot of Dutch streetwear brands have made it quite big internationally, like Filling Pieces and Pata,
right,
and Daily Paper, whereas you don't have that at all in Germany. No. They're very much homegrown, and they're for homegrown people. So it's a bit of similar, and like they have more parallels in common, the Danes and the Swedes and the Germans and the Dutch. We always say that the Danes and the Dutch are like the naughty younger sibling.
That's interesting.
Whereas the Swedes and the Germans are more of the, you know, it's a bit more clean, it's a bit more professional, you know.
Right.
Whacking the finger at the younger sibling.
Right. But you see similarities between Netherlands and Scandinavia.
Oh yeah, for sure. Also, just the culture of being proud for your company, but always being very, of your country, I mean, but always being very outward looking. You know, it's funny, us Dutch, we have such a, we take ourselves very seriously in our Dutchness, but at the same time, we're such an international country. If you look at the amount of public-facing people, from models to DJs to businesses that we've birthed over the years, they're all Dutch, but we only have 17 million people, you know? At the same time, you go into the Netherlands and all like the culture we have with like King's Day, and many more things. Like we're really proud of that. So it's a bit of a strange contrast. So
we're here at Pitti Uomo in Italy. It's January 8th. So we just entered this sort of new year and new decade. What are you most excited about right now, and what's important to focus on in the time to come here?
With fashion?
Yeah, and just your work in general. Are you going to be in fashion, or you're going to...
Yeah. Oh, for sure. I think what we'll see a lot more is that this is what I mentioned before, that fashion will no longer just be about fashion. And we've already seen that, it's always been the case, but we'll see that even more now. Fashion will become more important, both from an art side, both from a music side. All roads lead to fashion, essentially.
Right.
I'm looking forward to creating a difference that's not just for the fashion industry in that case, that's heard by wider people. And I think what we'll see as well in the next couple of years on the fashion perspective is people will look outside of their bubble. That's a bit of a subsequent point. People will no longer be just looking towards, fashion won't be looking at fashion anymore. Fashion will be speaking to interviews in to experts in the financial sector, to people from the agriculture sector. All of a sudden, what can we learn from all these different industries and apply it to fashion? That's what's really exciting. That's what we hopefully can drive, as journalists.
Final question. I just wanted to briefly talk about your own Instagram, which I think is so exquisitely curated.
Thanks, man.
The name escapes me. I can't. What does that mean for starters?
It means geography in Dutch.
Geography?
Yeah, I was really naff, and I was 18. I wanted the Instagram name not to be my name, so I was just thinking about really random things, and it was between this or like bread,
Right.
So bread was taken.
When you search Christopher Morency, I think it'll show up. But what do you want to do with your Instagram? Because both your feed, but your stories is just every day. It's like 25 stories of things you captured all over the.
Yeah, I post a bit too much. It's my Instagram page is really about what I like. I see it as like a Tumblr, like many other people do. It's like a mood board almost. Things that it comes back to what we were saying. What you want fashion? What does fashion mean?
Right.
It's a visual identity. That's the same thing with, I think, Instagram for everyone. I don't like posting too many pictures of myself. I'll keep those for the stories. But on the feed itself, I take a lot of images from friends of mine. I take them from Tumblr, from other accounts I follow that I'll repost. It needs to say something about me, right? It's like the food I like, the image making that I like. And my girlfriend's a stylist, so we're very image oriented. We really like looking at images. And it's a bit of a strange contrast between that and the stories, which I think a lot of people have. Is like the difference between LinkedIn and your Tinder, right? It's like two different personalities.
Right.
That's what we have on the stories and on the feed, I think. On the feed, it's basically going to parties and to fashion shows and to meeting friends and just hanging out, which will leave after 24 hours so people don't have to see it and they can go back to the aesthetically beautiful thing. But the funny thing is I got approached recently by this guy who wanted to buy my Instagram name for like 2,000 euros.
Really?
Because he wanted to start like a whole account on geography, like on Dutch geography. And I probably get tagged, I would say like a good 5 to 10 times a week by really young kids, like 10 to 15. That are Dutch kids that are in school, and they're like, I fucking hate my geography teacher. And then they tag me because my name is obviously geography.
Right.
And I always respond, I'm like, don't say that, And they're always like, oh my God, they always laugh. So
maybe that's an arm right there onto the fashion world for those kids.
Yeah, it's funny. And it's nice. What's nice, what I didn't like when I was growing up, obviously Instagram wasn't what it is now, but there was no way in to look at fashion. I moved to London 4 years ago, not knowing one person. So you really have to navigate in that system yourself, and you really have to hustle to find out who can I find that is cool, who can take me under their wing and bring me to shows, who can introduce me to people, who's going to teach me how to write, who's going to give me tips on what accounts to follow, what newspapers to read, all that stuff. And if I can do even like a bit of that, or at least show them brands that they should be paying attention to, or being like, you can get into it through this and this, you should follow these brands. I get approached quite often on my LinkedIn and on my Instagram by literally kids that are like 15, like, how do I get into fashion? What do I do? Like, is the design the only job I can take? And I always take time to just speak to them, even if it's for 2 minutes, to be like, just
That's a hard question though. What do you say to them?
Well, it depends. I always tell them, think in company. That's how I think. How do you get into fashion on a company perspective? So I knew I wanted to work for the business of fashion. I knew I wanted to work for Fantastic Man. I knew I wanted to work for Highsnobiety. What that role wasn't necessarily defined in the beginning, early in my career. So I would do anything I could do. I would speak to them. I'm like, I have interest in writing and I have interest in A, B, and C, but I'm willing to do anything else, because that's how you really find out what you like and what you don't like. I think a lot of kids that go to school nowadays, they think they have this amazing job waiting for them, after the 4 years with an amazing pay and amazing days off and amazing responsibility and amazing team and amazing travel and all the perks. And that just literally does not exist. You have to create it for yourself.
For sure. I think that's a great tip, and to sort of to get into the scene and be useful in it early on, because you have to hustle in a way in the beginning.
Absolutely. I mean, you know this.
Of course. And since starting Scandinavian Man, I've had, we always have a couple of interns at a time, and I had, at one point, I'm not going to name names, but I got a kid that, came from this sort of rich family, and I kind of knew his dad, and I sort of, as a favor, kind of, gave him the chance. And he came in for a couple of days, and I gave him a couple of assignments, but then he just sat there. And I was like, "What are you doing?" Like, I'm waiting for the next thing you're going to tell me to do. It's like, that's not how it works, son. We had a showroom, we had a bunch of stuff happening. It's just help someone here. There are people running around, working their ass off. You can just sit around. Obviously he didn't continue this internship that long, but I think that's lesson number one. Be useful to and place yourself in the environment that you want to be, at least as close as you can to the environment that you want to be in, and be useful there.
It's such a simple tip as well. It's, it's a very simple tips of be the first one and the last one out.
Right.
But at the same time, don't let people step on you. Pay your dues and then have an opinion after that. You first have to pay your dues and then you can have an opinion.
Right. Well, Christopher, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah,
and
thanks for having me.
I'd like to thank you for all you contribute to the fashion world and also your coverage on the Scandinavian scene. I'd love to welcome you again to Stockholm and Scandinavia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's do this again sometime.
Let's do it.
This has been The Innovators, an interview show from Scandinavian Man with me, Konrad Olsson. We'll be back soon with more conversations on design, culture, fashion, technology, and sustainability. For more news and interviews from the Scandinavian fashion and culture scene, visit scandinavianman.com. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
That was so much fun. Really good at this. I mean, I'm very